I'm just a touch under the weather, so I'm gonna be a little coughing and stuff, but it
No,
should be fine.
no worries. And yeah, welcome, Dave Farina. Thanks for your time today.
Howdy, yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I generally do philosophically minded political essays on YouTube. And so
Hmm.
when I reached out to you, I led with the tagline "Science is a mythology," which I kind of imagined a kind of bull-like snort of anger coming from your note. I did sort of emphasize that I had my tongue in cheek, and there's kind of a metaphorical aspect to that. But yeah, just before getting into that, mostly, I just a couple of things to mention. I do appreciate your work on YouTube. I generally only watch the ones I'm directly interested in, and that's the foundation of philosophy. But I do, and this will be relevant later. I do still watch the debunking videos, which and as you've alluded to recently, tend to kind of do well and get an audience. So I do want to put that out there because, like I say, it will be relevant. The second
Sure.
sort of intro thing is I've obviously done some videos on Hannah Arendt's Between Past and Future. It's something I've done quite a lot of time in, but I'm not invested in it, and I'm not. I know I'm just a guy with one book written by one person in the past, so I'm not sort of coming at this from a sort of high-minded, grandiose perspective. I hope anyway, but still. But just so to get into it first, to sort of introduce the topic, you're a champion of science, but it's probably fair to describe you as a materialist to some extent. But just how hard a materialist are you in sort of philosophical terms?
Pretty hard, I think. To me, it's just the tidiest worldview is to just believe that there is nothing but the physical realm.
Right,
So,
pretty
yeah.
hard. And what about free will? Where does free will come into that, or does it?
Free will is tricky. People have asked me that. I don't really know. Uh, I mean, luckily, with the quantum revolution, we no longer have to subscribe to a rigid determinism. So I feel like there's some kind of room. That combined with the fact that we don't have a complete understanding of consciousness yet,
Right.
there's like a little bit of wiggle room there.
Yeah.
But I don't really know, and I don't lean too hard either way.
Right, right, and there's so only so much we can know.
Yeah.
I from fairly early age. I mean, I now live in Asia, but even when I was living in the UK originally, I always leaned more towards Taoism as a kind of philosophical framework which touches on religion. Do any of them, the major world sort of thought systems and the religious ones in particular, do any of them have anything to say to you in the way that you approach life, or do you just kind of keep all of that totally out of it?
No, nothing whatsoever. I think the closest would be kind of a Buddhism or Taoism, as you say, which I regard as more of a philosophy. Um, I think the only thing Buddhism, the Buddhists, I think, had it right when they say that expectation is the root of all suffering.
Right.
I think that's very wise, and I try to keep that in mind as I move through life. But other than that, no. And certainly in terms of the raw spirituality and the mythology of the major religions, that has no wisdom for me. Yeah.
Right. And so do you identify with the term the meaning gap that's come up sort of recently and particularly in the modern world? Do you know what that refers to?
I do not.
Sorry, it's I think it was John Vervaeke, and it's this idea of people in the modern world, especially, don't particularly know where to go for wisdom or a larger direction or meaning generally. And I think this is something that came up in between, or comes up in between past and future as well. But I mean, do you see that the meaning gap, the lack of meaning, maybe not in your own personal life, but in the world more broadly or in people? And do you feel qualified to judge other
Yeah,
people on that regard, I suppose?
I think that may be true, and it certainly would explain the rise of the internet guru, thinly disguised demagogue, your Jordan Petersons and your figures like that, sort of
Mm.
usurping the attention of large swaths of mainly confused young men, but just generally having an impact culturally in a way that probably, I mean, well, certainly would have happened before the advent of the internet. So maybe a lot of people being disenfranchised by religion and kind of having nothing to fill that void. I think there's probably some truth to that.
Right. Okay. So, like I said, I led with science is a mythology when I first contacted you, and do you have a blind reaction to that before I expand, or I mean, obviously it's somewhat provocative, I think, but
Yeah. I mean, my blind reaction is that that's obviously dead wrong and that science is completely antithetical to
yeah,
mythology.
yeah,
But obviously, you're joking or something. So
yeah,
go
yeah.
ahead and tell me what you mean.
Oh, exactly. Okay. So yeah, I mean, taking it in the context of Hannah Arendt and many other people as well have talked in the sense that it's about narratives. When we establish meaning, or one of the paths to meaning will eventually be through narratives. And so, in order for any sort of system to have meaning, there will need to be some kind of narrative behind it, and we'll come back into that. I think I certainly, and I believe it's fair to say of Arendt to take what the unreasonable effectiveness of math in the natural sciences, that term, as being like a hard piece of data. It's like, well, clearly it works. Clearly that's a thing that works, and the system is the secret source, the scientific method and all of that. On the other hand, it does seem like, especially again in the modern age, there's an inscrutability to the processes of science, and this might be something that you've tackled before, and things can really sound like. I mean, just as an example, the Five Sigma standard for data accuracy, it sounds like some weird kind of arcane knowledge. It's not. It has a perfectly reasonable definition, but especially as everything gets far too complicated for one person to really comprehend, a narrative needs to kind of come through, and I think that might be what science as a mythology might be intended to be. I don't know. Do you want to react to that?
Sure. I mean, I think the thing is that you can forge a narrative out of almost anything. I
Mhm.
mean, even when we learn science, and when you learn chemistry in 10th grade, you learn the evolution of the atomic theory in a way that could be conveyed as a narrative, right? Dalton figured this out, and then J.J. Thomson figured this out, and we refined that, and then Rutherford figured this out, and then Bohr figured this out, and then Schrodinger figured this out, and so it's like a story, and I think it's compelling when taught that way. So they are all this. You do have each individual datum, and you can view it as raw data, or you can make a story out of it. But yeah, I think stories are good, so why not use them?
Yeah, well, but does it relate in a sense to a mythology in that sense? Only in the way that the story is becomes what represents science to people who don't actually get into the nuts and bolts.
I mean, the only way I would contrast it with mythology is that mythology is understood to be symbolic when it is created, right? The writers of mythology know that they're using symbols in fiction to
Right.
convey a greater
Okay.
truth,
Mm.
whereas, John Dalton and J.J. Thompson, like they existed. We know that they certainly did exist. They're real people. But
Right.
it can have the aura of a mythology, I suppose.
I
It can
think,
have the same effect.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's well, as far as I would want to go with it, certainly.
Sure.
Although I think there might be a need, perhaps, and especially if we've learned anything from the past week, it's that certain narratives can take powerful hold, regardless of whether or not
Sure.
they're true.
Yes, they can.
So yeah, whether or not science, the narrative of, like you just laid it out, like I said, like you said, it is a compelling story, the
Yeah.
discovery of science, but not everyone sort of takes it on that way.
Hmm.
Just one more distinction I wanted to make before we move on is what comes up in Arendt is the distinction between the world and the universe. The universe being nature in its kind of raw physics and chemistry, etc., and the human
Uh-huh.
world being humanly constructed things. And she draws kind of a bright line between the human world as a work of artifice and the nature and the universe more broadly. Is that a line you would recognize, or does that strike anything with you?
Sure. I mean, as a reductionist, everything breaks down to the thing below it. So, I mean, even sociology and economics and things, if you break it down step by step, you're going to get down to physics and then eventually logic. But practically speaking, I think it's fair to look at something like sociology or economics in a little bit of a different way from, say, theoretical physics, right? I mean, they're definitely different academic fields for good reason. So,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And there's a gray area somewhere where we started to build things, but maybe we'll come back to that. Sorry.
Yeah, somewhere
Uh,
around biology. Yeah.
yeah. So just get a quick answer on something you've probably answered before, but what is your boilerplate response when it comes to what is science? When someone says, "But what is science?" though, in that really annoying way, what do you generally come back?
Science is the way in which we gather information about the physical world. It is the empirical manner in which we figure out how things work, gather data. But it also, I think it's fair to also regard it as a body of knowledge, right? You could open up a science textbook and say there's science in here, right? That which has been gathered and that which we can learn and come to know about the universe based on the fruits of the labor of those who came before us. So I would call it a method as well as a body of knowledge. I would say it's both of those things.
Okay. So yeah, science as a process or as a verb and a noun, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. And now you didn't use the word process, but I'm just going to sort of tie because method, process kind of sort of come close
Sure.
to these. Um, and process is something that very quickly, I promise I won't, but in one of the essays in Between Past and Future, we go from an ancient concept of history where the nature is immortal and we are mortal. Then we go in Christian terms to we become the immortals, the immortal soul, and nature just passes away. And then into the modern world where both of those things now, according to science, seem kind of ridiculous. It's not like we are mortals necessary and nature goes on forever. It might end. But equally, we're obviously not creatures of soul according to science. So all we've got left is the process. And Arendt kind of cites that as almost the reason for the meaning gap, in a way, the idea that we have now been forced into this concern for primarily process. And so we've lost the meaning of the nouns. It's interesting you brought up the idea of science as a body of knowledge, something that could be held onto as well, actually. But yeah, sorry, well, I've lost where I was for a moment there. Yeah, the idea that process is not progress and that it might be the reason for the meaning gap or the problem behind the meaning gap. Does that kind of ring any bells there with you?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe as it relates to the human condition and having to accept the fleeting nature of everything and coming to terms with mortality. I think coming to terms with mortality is a big part of the development of an individual person as well as a civilization as a whole. And I think that a lot of individuals have been able to be brave enough to do that, but I think that humans as a whole haven't gotten there because I think that the vast majority of humans don't accept that and believe that they will live eternally through their various deities and such. And I think that's actually probably one of the most important distinctions between the ways that humans can think, probably accepting mortality and denying mortality. So
Right. Okay. Right. So yeah. So the accepting of mortality is the primary kind of individual task in a way.
yeah,
Although then, as you say, it scales up to the civilization.
yeah,
We may
definitely.
come back onto that. Cool. So just moving on to science deniers specifically. I mean, what when you do the videos which tackle debunking people who you regard as denying science, what's your first approach and your kind of way that you're going to tackle the subject?
Well, there are two tracks. First, you want to provide accurate scientific information. Here's a thing that we know, and here's how we know it, right? Devoid of any commentary of some figure. But then it's also very important to take those bad faith actors who distort what we know scientifically, lie about it, and specifically deconstruct their rhetoric, right? So here's the thing we know. This is the thing that they say. Here's how we know that they're wrong and lying, and possibly elucidate their motives and things like that. So it's a two-tiered approach always, I think.
Right. Okay. And you talked about their motive. I mean, what is the spread of motives? I mean, some of them you say are just straight up grifters. Are there generally more, as it were, good faith, bad faith actors? Are any of those out there?
Well, okay, I mean, no, I mean, they're all bad faith actors in one way or another. Most of them are just making money. Some of them are working to some broader political goal. Uh, so power would be, but money is power. So,
Right.
but and then there are people who I think get swept up and are sort of copycat grifters. They get entranced by some narrative and then find themselves in servitude of that narrative,
Mm.
but are a bit more innocent in that regard. It's an ideological thing. They think that they're serving this nugget of truth when they've just been bamboozled. But the chief architects are grifters to the core. I've never seen any example to the contrary of that. So.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunate. So you don't consider your work to be kind of outreach or the debunking work. It's not sort of outreach at that point. You're just pretty much.
Well, I mean, look, the people that are the absolute deepest in something are not reachable.
Mhm.
There's no amount of factual information or language or they cannot be persuaded. Right? There's a mental block there. I'm not going to reach them. So I'm going to put all this information out and I'm going to make it as easily digestible as possible. Some of them that are a little bit more shallowly into it might, get their head jogged a little bit. People who are on the fence and sort of looking at all the information they can find, I'll definitely get some of those. And then the rest, the rational people, can. I pride myself, I think, in having an ability to offer this information in a very compartmentalized, succinct, clear, digestible way so they can take the information that I provide, the explanations that I provide, and they can disseminate them in their own personal circles. Maybe they'll have more success with somebody that's immediately around them. I'm just some guy on the internet, right? So, but you can't go into it thinking the number one diehard fan of this grifter, I gotta get that. It's not going to happen. It will not.
Right.
So you chip away at it, right? If I can get a few percent here and I can spread this message over there, it's going to have a quantifiable impact. It's just not going to be total. You can't expect it to be. So.
So yeah, and the when you use the mental block, that point, the point at which somebody has that block, is that, and I'm kind of pulling definitions out of what you say, but do correct me if I'm wrong. Is that where you would call them, go from calling them just somebody looking around to being an active science denier, somebody who actively denies?
Sure. I mean, that's just a surface level description of them. They are denying a certain aspect of science, but it goes a lot deeper than that because whatever has caused them to deny that science, they've turned that into part of their identity. And so when you try to destroy someone's identity, they will react violently as though you're trying to murder them. It's almost the same reaction.
Yeah.
So there's unfortunately they either have to go through some personal growth with themselves and come to terms with factual information out of their own accord. And so when they're ready, there it is there for them. But in the moment, it's not going to happen. So
Yeah, you're not going to get somebody, you can't punt them out in that moment.
yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to well, just before I move to, there's the person who doesn't trust the process of science, who we just talked about. The person who generally is looking around and is would you would regard as good faith in general, but maybe just doesn't know enough. Do they need to have, and again, I'm playing a little bit with words, do they need to have a certain amount of faith in science in order to just kind of go with some of the things they're being told? Even like you say, that the information is there for them to look at, but realistically, most people are not going to, trawl through any number of science books. They'll get at best a surface level reading. So is there some level of quote unquote faith required there? And I use that word kind of
Sure. I mean, you're not totally wrong. I mean, the good news is that I think a surface level understanding of most subjects is enough to reject at least 90% of the people that are grifting out there, because most attempts are just so unsophisticated and so infantile that high school level knowledge will be enough, But then it gets a little trickier, and you do end up finding yourself just searching for figures that you can trust, and that kind of implicit trust is a form of faith. I think that's accurate in delineating it that way. But yeah, I forgot the first part of the question, but yeah,
Okay.
that's totally accurate.
Yeah, and that leads us into the kind of social media landscape as well, of course.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
because I mean, oh, I remember the first part of it. It just the point of it is that, and I frequently say this in my talks, just the unfortunate situation that we are in, due to the unbelievable progress that occurred in the 20th century in every single area of science. There's just way too much science. Scientists themselves are experts in a tiny sliver of a subfield of an individual field of science. They can't even get their heads completely around the neighboring subfield, right? It's everybody is severely limited in their capacity to understand as much as they can out of the entirety of scientific knowledge. So everybody is trusting to some degree. There's no doubt about it. So
Right. Yeah. Well, actually, well, okay. Let me skip over one to come back to that. So, well, that kind of brings up what I think, and so I like I say, I lean Taoist, but when I'm pressed on metaphysical things, I describe myself as agnostic, which is just sort of my own little perversion of agnostic, as in it's just we cannot know certain things. There may be any number of things that are true, but that we cannot know them for whatever reason. I mean, it's not particularly satisfying, and you can't really go anywhere with it. Uh,
sure.
but yeah, so the idea of us being compelled by only narratives, I just wanted to sort of we are led to that if you can't know certain things by a certain radical skepticism, a sort of Cartesian doubt, which is a term that some have used. And so we're only left with narratives that we're able to make. So I just wanted to run a couple of levels of this past you. Do you think that science will always, as in necessarily, be a narrative for non-scientists, people in just living everyday lives who have no part of it?
For nonsense. I mean, maybe, but I mean, just the thing is, if you're a scientist and you say, I have this theory, and on the basis of this theory, I'm going to run this experiment. If in this experiment I get result A, I will conclude X. If I get result B, I will conclude Y. Right? Your conclusion is hinging on the empirical results here. That's not really a narrative unless you force it to be. And I think that even a non-scientist can wrap their head around how methodical that kind of conclusion is.
Right.
You can turn it into a story, into a narrative if you like, and
Well,
you could and you should maybe. I don't know, but
it's not so much that I think as just well, I mean, obviously, uh, scientists do their thing, they get the results, and sometimes that results in changes to the world, and particularly the human world that everyone can see. Which, and again, I'm bringing in something from Hannah Arendt here, the idea of common sense, not in the sort of everyday meaning, but just in the sense of, okay, a thing that we can all see with our human everyday experience. Not that everyone does see it, but we can all see it. That's sort of the way she says that we judge humanity in a direct sense, and that's where the narratives come from. And that is something almost apart from science, in that you can't get the data and the logical process that comes out of that and install that into people in their everyday lives. It's just like you said, it's just not going to happen. So
yeah,
uh,
especially if you're talking about people and not some very simple experiment, because people are such chaotic systems that we're not cognizant of all these tiny variables all the time. We're
so for
just
people
making
to
broad
so for
judgments.
people to really take on science, everyday people to take on science, there needs to be a broader narrative there of what science is, what it does, the way that we can trust it, or so to speak, that kind of thing. So is that kind
Uh-huh.
of narrative going to be a necessary thing, do you think?
Yeah, no, but I mean, luckily in the 21st century, we have so many examples,
True.
so many stories of how science gave us this, right? Science gave us that. Science fixed this. Science fixed that. I mean, it's just endless. You can make hours and hours of content talking about, smallpox vaccines and crap like that. It's just, it's really hard for me as someone who is fairly knowledgeable in science to wrap my head around somebody being a science denier, even in any singular area. But there are people who really just top to bottom, just no, thank you, not for me. I can't really fathom that. You know,
Okay. Well, I actually I agree. It's astonishing, but I'm going to press with something else a little bit. So, if if it is necessary that everyday people have some idea of science as a narrative in their everyday life, I would ask, is it also is that also true of scientists insofar as scientists also have an everyday life? Is science a broader narrative for you in your everyday life when you're not doing science? Is that could that be true in some sense?
I think so. I mean, scientists are all people ultimately, and we all have the same concerns, whether we have a particular profession or not. Some people go into the lab and do science, even if they do, they still have to pay taxes, and if they have kids and stuff like that. Um, I think scientists have a more pristine, or at least a more accurate version of the narrative of the scientific endeavor, one that's more aligned with what actually has been occurring over the past few centuries than your average layperson. But sure, I think the narrative the scientific endeavor as a quest for knowledge, right? I mean, it's very compelling. We have to be careful not to let it slip into every little nook and cranny as we examine everything that every scientist does. But in a very broad sense, it's entirely accurate to refer to the scientific endeavor as a quest for knowledge, a quest of understanding of the universe.
Yeah, sorry, that last thing you said when you said not letting it seep in, do you mean like not allowing the narrative to impact upon the way science is done on the ground level?
Yeah, an individual researcher, neither the way that they conduct themselves nor the way we interpret what an individual researcher has done. I actually just did a piece on this. It was for the stuff I did with Sabina Hassenfelder, and science is dying, science is failing, blah, blah, blah. Just complete bullshit. I actually read a couple of papers, and one in the scientific literature, there's people discussing, all of this and talking about these common narratives that may not be conducive to helping the public understand science. One of them is the quest narrative, all right, and trying to be careful about not framing every aspect of the scientific endeavor that way, down to the minutia, right? Some of us are just going in and doing what needs to be done. It doesn't always have to be framed as this noble quest, but broadly speaking, I think it's entirely accurate, and the narrative that most people can and should latch on to.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. And so interesting that the quest is not something that's regarded as useful in getting that word out.
Yeah.
Okay. Last one then, and this is where I'm again pushing a little bit further. So if it is always a narrative, even sometimes for scientists in their everyday life, if there is a certain level of, well, there's a point at which we cannot know, is there always going to be a narrative, even for scientists in their scientific life, in the sense that if there are questions we cannot answer, or as Arendt would say sometimes, that the data we get is not actually based on sense anymore. We just get it from like a readout on a computer, maybe even just a list of numbers. So we're not perceiving the world. Now, don't get me wrong, the repeatability, the process, all of that, but if we literally don't have any common sense understanding of what science is and what it does, and maybe even can't think in the ways that it works, is there going to be a narrative necessary within science at that point?
I mean, I think what you're saying has some, maybe for a theoretical physicist, where you're examining the universe on such a fundamental level that you're rubbing up on philosophy.
Right.
Sure, I would buy what you're selling here for a theoretical physicist, but how does this apply to like an ecologist or a microbiologist? They don't have to think that way. They're not thinking, is the universe a simulation? Is there a deity? They're just thinking, how does this bug affect the tree? And it's like, it's all right there.
That's a case in which much of the data is still sense-based, I suppose. And maybe that's the distinction to draw there. And of course, it doesn't. But insofar as you do have data that's not sense-based, maybe there is a sense of like, well, I have to kind of work something out for what
if you're doing pure math and it's all just up here, there's a lot of room to it's a little bit different.
And I guess this is maybe the space out of which these kind of science denying narratives can emerge as well. It's unfortunately, as much as it's always there, it's the dangerous space.
Yeah, and it's something that I've actually been talking about a lot recently in dealing with Sabina Hassenfelder, Eric Weinstein, these kinds of people. Taking this narrative of physics is broken, just because of some stagnation in like hard theoretical physics, broadening that to physics is dying, and then broadening that into science is dying in general.
Mhm.
It's shocking how common this narrative is, and how the public latches onto it to then distrust information regarding epidemiology or immunology or just completely unrelated fields, and then deny the fruits of those fields.
The infection, yeah, the spreading from like you say, the maybe some of those original more metaphysical regions of science where there is stagnation out into more broad things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I do want to come back quickly to the social media aspect. So as it happens, we have interacted directly once before over a comment, and I was talking. There was, I think it was one of the debunking videos, bald, egg-headed guy. It's a long time ago, and it was basically about tone, and that's what I'm going to bring up. And I'm sure this is something you've tackled before, but it's what I call the Tyson Dawkins sort of effect. I don't know if you've ever seen that clip of Neil deGrasse Tyson talking to Richard Dawkins about the way he sometimes his tone on occasions. Have you ever seen that clip? I don't know.
I may have, but I'm not recalling it. I would imagine that Tyson was insinuating that Dawkins is a little bit stuffy and has a superiority complex or something like that.
Also, his bluntness as well, and I mean, you
Yeah.
brought up bluntness in the Sabina Hosselfelder video recently, and how you sometimes
Yep.
make use of it. And on that occasion, I think me and another commenter were saying something like, "Do you have to be so blunt?" And you're, of course, yeah. I think the end of it, obviously, if I'm remembering correctly, you said something about people needing to have um, intellectual honesty in order to be able to accept the things that you're saying.
Mhm.
And again, I can't disagree. On the other hand, I don't think we can rely on people's intellectual honesty at the time,
No.
as well as at the time. And I don't know if you've come any further on that in, oh God,
Yeah, but let's be clear. Ultimately, it's a stylistic choice here. Like I'm not saying this is how you do it. I'm
mm,
saying this is how I do it. I
mm,
don't think I can do it any other way. I can't mince words. I can't. It's just not my personality. And I go and I speak to science undergrads and grad students to encourage them to enter science communication as a career. And I'm very clear in saying, look, there's a lot of ways to do this, and we need all the ways. We
yeah.
need people communicating science with every style, with every tone, in every language, to every demographic, on every platform. Right? We need all the ways of doing this. So I have my way. It's not the right way. It's my way. And I know science communicators who are the polar opposite of me tonally. Obviously, the goal is still to convey accurate information and to persuade, but their tone is dramatically different, and I regard them as highly effective in a certain way. There are pros and cons of any approach. Mine, the pro, is that you're not going to misunderstand what I'm saying. It's very clear. I'm driving it home with the utmost clarity. This is what it is. Don't like it, deal with it. The con is that I'm going to piss some people off and maybe push a few people farther down the pipeline just because their defense mechanism will be to go, oh, this arrogant guy thinks he knows everything, blah, right? But then you go to the flip side, and there are people who are very, very agreeable, and so much so that the charlatans that we're trying to expose will even agree to debate them live. Most people don't want to debate me because they know what's going to happen. But these more agreeable folks, the charlatans will agree to debate them, and then they'll get along, and then you'll go to the comment section, and this is what you'll see. Wow, what an incredible conversation. It was so respectful. It was really a lesson in how to disagree amicably. Ultimately, it didn't change my mind about anything, and I'm going to continue believing what I'm believing. But what an incredible example of how we can get along, right? So that's the con. The pro is that you have a little bit more chance of getting under someone's radar because you're, hey, buddy, I'm just a nice guy. But the con is that you're ultimately you're lending a little bit of exaggerated credence to the person that you're talking with by pretending that it's something that can be debated when it just isn't. So pros and cons.
Yeah, yeah, and that do you think that there might be some who, though, people who leave that kind of comment you're talking about that, oh, what a great debate and things like that. Are those not the sort of people who, while they won't have been moved in the moment, they might that might, seeing that debate will be one nudge along the line. It's not necessarily a con
Sure.
wholly, perhaps, but
But they might come back to what I did later too when they're
yeah,
mature enough to accept the
okay.
facts.
But
So,
certainly could go either way.
yep.
Cool. Okay, so there's so coming back to the thread between science and mythological structures, should we say, there's a problem that we seem to be having that seems to speak to a possible link between them in some regard as well, and that is that it seems like the problems that people are having with properly done science today is made worse because of the prior sort of legitimate concerns we had with the previous theories of everything, like religion and things like that. The idea that, well, our previous big hope for salvation and understanding the world didn't pan out. So we got this sort of natural skepticism towards the next one, combined with the genuine skepticism of the whole scientific emergence as well. So
Well,
um,
that's very confusing to me. You think that because of the failure of religion that people will be skeptical towards science?
I,
You'd think that you would embrace the polar opposite of religion
well,
if you
no,
didn't like it.
I guess it's in the context of a broader narrative. If religion was the theory of everything, for want of a better word, and now science is that, and religion failed, then science could fail. That's the thought process. I'm not saying that that's and again with a radical skepticism sort of lurking in the background. How can somebody get out of that possibility at the end of the day, and then they get led down sort of the darker rabbit holes of sort of not believing things.
Sure. I mean, the irony of a radical skeptic falling for science denial is not lost on me. I deal with that every day.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, people will find a reason to distrust anything. It's ultimately, it's rhetoric and it's a certain type of person that will persuade someone to deny science. It's not something that people arrive at out of their own accord, right? They rely on these narratives, as you say, from these demagogues to reject science. It's not something they go, oh, this virologists look at viruses every day. You know what? I don't think they're real. Nope, no virus. No, they have to rely on frickin' Stefan Lanka or any of these jerks to
Right.
persuade them that viruses aren't real, despite the fact that virology is a field of science that exists. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Okie dokie. Um, I just want to lay out one more little piece of Arendtian background, which then ask you to comment on. Hannah Arendt thought that Plato and philosophy through history had focused far too much on what she called the vita contemplativa, which is basically the philosophical life, thinking and sitting around contemplating your navel or whatever. She was much more focused on the vita activa, which is why she called herself a political theorist and not a philosopher. The
mhm.
vita activa has three levels. The bottom level is labor, where you sustain the biological process. You basically just do what you need to do to go on living. The second level is work, where we fabricate those things which are part of the human world. We create the human artifice. And then the top level is action, where individuals express their individuality, to put it very basely. Obviously, I'm butchering that into one soundbite, but the point for science is that all of science seems to be aimed at this central area of fabrication, of making things, of coming up with a result, of proving the hypothesis true or false, and so on. And it seems to be in the context of the Vita Activa that there's life down at the base there. That's where we have our basic life experience as humans, and then up at the top the action is where all the high-minded philosophy and talk, high-minded talk goes on. And then the most beautiful things that we have are up at the very top of our culture and then tie back to the bottom. And that
Mm.
is religion. The Roman term is religare, that which ties back. Okay, sorry, I'm
Interesting. I
landing.
did not know that etymology. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that as well. I mean, don't take me as a sort of authority in any sense on any of this. But to land the plane on that. So science takes place in in this region where all of our ideas come up towards action. We fabricate it, we control it, we impose our patterns on it. We always do violence to the raw materials in the process of fabrication. That which ties back to go to the Taoist angle is more of a surrender. And this is where religion as an entity becomes kind of apparent in the model. It's something that where you can tie these high-minded ideas of action and culture back to the life process of humanity and just experiencing being human without having to go through the process of fabricating or controlling anything. You just surrender to it and it happens. Obviously, we're hand wave. I'm waving my hands genuinely here. It all is all hand wavy. I'm not suggesting a process or a model here,
Yeah.
but that's the Vita Activa. And do you think that some kind of idea of science forming a barrier between these two realms of the human, does that resonate at all, or do you see any talk of that?
I don't really see the barrier. I mean, I understand what you're saying about religion. As an artist, I would replace religion with art. I would say that art does that for me.
Mm.
That's where I get my transcendence. But I think that the best scientists are also doing that. I think that the best examples of science have an element of transcendence to them. So
Can you give some
I
examples of that? Sorry, just science that really expresses a certain transcendence in the way that it's done.
I think Einstein. I mean, you mentioned that this top tier, you're talking about self-expression, right? I mean,
Essentially.
the best scientists that truly forge new ground,
Mm,
that is self-expression. There's no
mm.
way it's not, right? That individual person did that thing, and they did so because of some individual gift that they had. I mean, when you revolutionize our conception of how the universe works, that's not only self-expression, but there's something transcendent about it. It's going to change the way that we think, just the way a good piece of art can change the way people think. So I think it's easier to do it with art than science, but I think the best science does it too.
Does get that to that level. Great,
Yeah.
great. Okay, so we're almost. I've got two more questions here. I hope I managed to keep the thread going generally. But
Hmm.
do you know James Lovelock?
I do not.
He's as one of, well, they sometimes call him one of the last genuine quote scientists in that he was a generalist. He recently died. He was over 100. Came up with the Gaia hypothesis. If you're familiar with that, the idea that Earth is a self-regulating system. He did claim he was somewhat haunted by the name and the New Age people surrounding it.
Ah, yes. Yeah.
At the same time, I think that's the kind of narrative that it needs. Although I wish it had taken off maybe a bit more. But
Hmm.
he was talking towards his later years of the revenge of Gaia and the need for not sustainable development, but sustainable retreat. So I don't know. Do you think that civilization A will and B should retreat in some way? Maybe in the face of the climate crisis, what you were referring to. Maybe in certain other ways. Do you think that there is a need for some kind of sustainable retreat before progress can be made?
It's a very good question. I don't know. It's possible. I mean, the thing is, I don't know the degree to which urbanization and overpopulation is really the root cause and the main threat here, because the thing is, if I'm looking at climate and I'm looking at, we're talking about a 2 degree warming effect. It's certainly within the domain of science to manufacture solutions to that problem.
Mhm.
There are so many ways, right? You can genetically engineer bacteria that consume CO2 at a million times the rate of other bacteria, distribute them along the surface of the ocean. There you go. We did it, right? We returned CO2 back. There, people are talking about things that we can put in the atmosphere and stuff like that. So these are all potential solutions. Are they going to work? Will we be able to implement them? I have no idea. So
Difficult field.
I'm a little bit more of this on the side of just like, no, we're going forward.
Okay.
We're only going forward. We're always going forward. There's no way to go but forward.
We're not going
Um,
back.
yeah, we're not going back. I mean, it's just the fact that it's not going to happen, whether we should or not. But maybe even going so far as to say, no, we shouldn't go
Mm,
back. But that's a level. I think I'm a pretty good generalist, but
mm,
the kind of generalist and futurist that you have to be to confidently make an assertion like that
yeah,
is kind of next level. I'm not sure if there's any generalist alive that could confidently make that assertion. So I'll make my timid assertion of
right.
no, forward we go.
Forward we go. Okay, and yeah, and hopefully, yeah, as you say, there are solutions there I'm sure we could find if we had the political will. I mean,
If we had the political will. The science is pretty, maybe not a slam dunk, but we're like, hey, here's some things that we definitely can try.
and
But
there is so well, it's with one sideline there. There is also the problem of occasionally, because of the way politics and science function together, there are incentives for scientists to fall in with political will on occasion or be led in certain
sure,
directions by political will, which is part of the edifice, I suppose, of science denial, or the edifice that supports
yes,
science denial.
and the propaganda that institutions put out to
Yeah.
encourage people to deny science that's ideologically uncongenial to their purposes.
So, I mean, what are the best ways if you're looking to get the straight dope on science in an unvarnished and unpropagandized way?
I mean, it's really not that complicated. Like what you learn in a geology 101, in a biology 101, in a physics 101, like all what you learn in college, it's just that's it. You know what I mean? Like most of my content, my academic tutorials are summarizing what's learned in first, second year undergrad for all of these different subjects, and it's done so without any specific application, right? It's not saying it's not really referencing any specific political situation. It's just here's some shit we know about molecules and rocks and stars. Like just know the basics, right? And that's something that I promote very heavily is general scientific knowledge for the masses.
And when it comes to the advancement of science, because that's what, again, coming back to common sense, that's the idea of what we can really see. What humans in living in a human world can see is the advancements of science, the big new things, Chat GPT, or that the big new technology which suddenly everyone is talking about. What's the best way to get the sort of unvarnished truth on some of the things that are cutting edge? Is there a way to do that, or do you really have to get down and dirty with the papers?
Much trickier, much better question, much trickier question to answer. I still will hold to the idea that getting that basic knowledge is going to prime you to better discern who to trust.
Okay.
But ultimately, you're probably going to be trusting somebody, especially when it comes to brand new technology. Unless you're the person who developed it or directly interfaces with it, when Bitcoin comes out or any of this stuff, none of us are, oh, it's definitely this or it's definitely that. We're all just waiting with bated breath to see what happens. But generalized knowledge is going to go a long way, right? There's so much stuff that comes out, and this is what I do for a living. Every day I get emails. Hey, I just saw this interview. I just saw this podcast. I just saw this thing. Is this guy a genius like he says, or is he an idiot? All right, I'm working on a piece right now. This Chris Langan released this this interview on the Daily Wire, and there's so many people who are like, he seems really smart. I'm like, how do you guys not know that this guy's completely full of shit? Come on, like,
Uh,
so it's just, and it's all just general knowledge. It's just
yeah,
knowing what things mean, and you know,
I tend to be there are times, but I tend to be the person who gets swept up in narratives. You might have noticed a bit about me, but yeah, with that
sure,
in mind, when I hear these people, on the first listening, I mean, certainly the Weinstein brothers, I was interested in them.
yeah.
Eric more than Brett, but yeah, less so now,
It
certainly.
happens, man. It happened. Like Eric. I mean, just because the guy that I'm doing the debunk on that I'll put out later this week
Mm.
there's a lot of parallels with Eric, but I noticed immediately that Eric's much better at it. They
Oh,
both pretend to have a theory of everything, but Eric can actually say math stuff, right? He understands math as well. He like any graduate student in math probably knows pretty much what he does, but it's still more than me. He knows more math than me, and I think I know a pretty good amount of math.
yeah.
So it's like, but this other guy is just like, dude, the guy doesn't even try. He doesn't even try to talk about math at all because he can't. But or like Terrence Howard, who says one times one equals
Yeah,
two.
make your own math. Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, this is 7-year-olds can debunk that,
Mm.
but it's it is the era of the internet guru for precisely some of the reasons we've been delineating an obsession with narrative, the meaning gap that you're talking about, where we're all kind of just like looking for someone. We're looking for the loud alpha male to do our thinking for us, right? And so the one who shouts the loudest and says, "I know the way, follow me."
Hmm.
They're going to get a lot of people, right? And that's what we're seeing right now. It's a proven business model to go on podcasts, call yourself a genius, say a bunch of shit that sounds smart to dumb people, and cash in. It's just where we are as a civilization right now. It's really unfortunate. So
Yeah, and on that vaguely hopeful but also slightly down note, we
a
shall
little bit. Yeah.
one last question. What should the tagline in the thumbnail be on this video? Should it be "Science is a mythology?" question mark exclamation mark, or "A chat with Dave Farina"? Period.
Oof, I don't know. I mean, the former's more provocative. I don't think provocative for the sake of I mean, it's you're putting me in a tight spot because I just did the whole stuff with Sabina about science is dying. So you know
Would you
what?
be offended if I used the former one?
I wouldn't be offended because I was here for the whole conversation, and we did not
Okay.
conclude that science was mythology.
Okay.
But and she does insist that science is failing.
The-
So there's a little bit of a difference, but I would say toss up whatever you feel like.
Okay, no worries. Well, with that, I'll go and do that. And Dave Farina, thank you very much for your time and your insights today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, absolutely.
Cheers now. Bye bye.
See ya.